I've been brought up in India, and so obviously, everybody in my position had read A Passage to India, because I don't think there's any doubt about it. It's the only really great masterpiece written about the Raj in India and that period. I mean, I think it's the only book that really shows both sides in all their advantages and disadvantages.
When I read the book, I thought, well, this is impossible to film, really, because it's very much a book about thoughts and people thinking, and I thought this is a very difficult book to film. But of course, I wasn't going to suggest that I didn't do it or anything like that.
I was intrigued to see how an adaptation of the book would work. I mean, the problem with the main problem with it is how do you deal with what happened in the cave? Because in the book, you can imagine it, you can do your own interpretation, but in a film, what you see is what you can draw on. So it's a very difficult conundrum, and I think that David Lean, in approaching the screenplay, I think had a huge mountain to climb. I mean, this was a book written in 1924 by a man who wasn't altogether enamored with the female psyche, about the female psyche. And I think David Lean tackled some of those issues incredibly successfully.
Getting David Lean was extraordinarily lucky. David, who spent a lot of time out in India, had been terribly upset when Dickie Attenborough had made Gandhi. You must understand that when he came to be involved in the film, hadn't made a film for about 14 years, I think. But he was quite determined, because he felt he knew about India, and he'd been married to an Indian, and he met his wife at that time in India. He was absolutely determined to write the script himself. He wrote it in Delhi. It was a very long process. I mean, I think it took him 18 months to write the script. And when David came out of his sort of hidey hole in Bora Bora, his first words were, well, what did happen in the caves? And of course, nobody's ever really come to any reasonable conclusion there. That was our big problem in Hollywood. They all loved the script, said they did. And one studio actually went to say, well, we will do the film. There's no problem about that, but we must have an explicit scene in the cave. Of course, it would have, destroyed the whole film. But on the other hand, they might have been right. They might have made a lot more money. But of course, we couldn't do that because it was a English classic, and we weren't about to screw it up. Luckily, Columbia put in $10 million. I mean, it's a long time ago, but even so, $10 million wasn't very much money. I think the whole picture cost somewhere in the region of $18 or $19 million, which is like chicken feed nowadays. But we didn't actually sort of get the money till it was quite late on in the game.
When we knew the film was greenlit, so to speak, immediately we went straight out to Bangalore because there was so much to be done out there. About 3 months before we started shooting, and most of that time was spent, actually, a month that was spent going around all the locations and finding some new ones with David and Sandra, his wife then.
After we'd found some of the locations, and we decided, of course, the biggest problem in India is crowd control. You can't just film. And so we had to have an environment where we felt we could do what we wanted. So we hired the huge Maharaja's palace in Bangalore.
What is very difficult to do in India, because the curiosity is a great national characteristic, is to control a big area without a lot of people getting in the way, and having control over the people and the shopkeepers and all of this. And what John Box did so brilliantly was to design the Indian bit of Chandrapur and the market within the grounds of the palace where we were, which is basically a scale model of Balmoral, but 3 times the size. And it was walled, and obviously we had security there at night and things, but it meant that you could control it.
The main set we built there was Chandrapur sort of main street with a police station and mosque one end and various other buildings along it. And this was peopled by on certain days, anything up to 1,000 extras, I should think, maybe 900 or 1,000 extras with a full market. And the arrival in Chandrapur, when the collector drives through in his car, is straight through that market. And that was a most extraordinary set, because we peopled it with villagers and locals, and in order to give it an authentic look, we actually gave everybody, a function for the day. We would give them a stall selling powdered paints and colours and things, and say, right, this is your stall for the day, so you've got to really try and sell it. And of course, we realised very quickly that the stalls which had food on it and things like that, which were going to suddenly actually get very, very empty, because they were going to try and really sell the food, and people were going to really eat the food. So we had to spin a tale through the crowds that actually the food had been treated with preservative and was poisoned, so the fruit and the veg wasn't, after 3 takes was completely gone.
Christopher told me that he couldn't work out why the extras budget for that day had sort of doubled. Of course, he didn't realise that all the guys were getting paid and then running around and joining the queue again, and they would just come round again. It was a magnificent set. We built everything in the film. Everything's a build. Because David liked control, and if you go down a real street, David can't control it. I mean, there are certain times of the day out there when you hear, wailing goes on, because it's a certain time of prayer. And of course, in the middle of the scene, get hold of that man! And well, you sort of can't do that. But he had no control, you see, so we'd stop. So he liked to control the set. And so we did just build them. A mile-long market. Build it.
We built all our sets in the grounds. In fact, we used the palace for all kinds of things, like the ship arriving in Bombay, the entrance to the towns, Ballard Pier, all kinds of things that we used it for. And it was a great back lot. It was a huge, huge success, that.
One of the other interesting preparations for creating a set was the creation of this field of elephant grass for Adila's journey on her bicycle, where she goes off on a trip, and she comes across these erotic statues in seemingly sort of very overgrown state. There again, about 3 or 4 months, maybe even more, but probably 4 or 5 months before we shot that, the location was chosen, and the elephant grass was actually planted and seeded at that time. When we chose the location, there was only probably 4 or 5 inches of scrub, and when we came back 4 or 5 months later, there was 5 to 6 feet of elephant grass. So we grew the set.
John Box was a genius at that sort of thing. He'd been a tank commander in the war, and he was just extraordinarily well organized and very, very talented and sensitive. So he was able to sort of produce anything that David wanted. I mean, the civilian lines, all those houses, are astonishing set he built, all neat, and all the entrances and the mosques and all that kind of thing. And then the market.
The detailing on John's sets was just incredible. I mean, you walked onto those sets and you just thought, this completely works. You talk about turning around, looking down the street, and you are looking down the street. It's a fantastic environment to work in, because you don't have to do anything. Really, you've been given the clothes, you've been given the set. All you've got to do is just do it. It's brilliant. It's what one remembers. For me, it was like just suddenly being introduced to me. I thought, well, wow, this is fantastic. This is the British film industry, at its best. Even though it is financed by America, but it was just an extraordinary place to be.
Reading the script, I thought it read extremely well as a story. The characters, when you're casting, you almost have to sort of I visualize actors playing those roles. And what David wanted from me was instincts on the English casting and the Indian casting.
People knew that David Lean was going to be making another film, and he'd chosen Passage to India as the basis of his story. So it was a book that immediately, as a young actor, you went out and bought and read. and came up to speed with.
I think every actor in London wanted to be seen for it, and I had great difficulty getting to be seen for it. David was thinking of other people for fielding, but eventually I got an interview. He wasn't that keen to meet me, but I did get the interview, and we got on terribly well. And almost there and then, I think he wanted to have me.
I was asked to go and meet him, and he said, sit down, and he said, what have you been doing? And I said, I'm doing The Jewel in the Crown. He said, good. Was that good? I said, yes, it's good. It's good fun. He said, come here, have a look. And then marched me out onto his balcony at the Berkeley Hotel and sort of said, this is a great view, isn't it? It's lovely. He said, I always stay in this suite. It's a lovely suite, lovely suite. He said, do you want some tea? Maybe you probably don't have any time. Listen, have a script and read it. Let us know. What do you think? All right, good. Nice to meet you. Off I went, read the script. I got told I had the part, and off I went.
I get a call from my agent saying, would you go and have a cup of tea with David Lean in the Berkeley Hotel? And I turned up, and I'd read the script, which I thought was fantastic, and I went up to his suite and met his wife, Sandy, and David said, did you write the script, old boy? And I said, I thought it was great. He said, would you like to play Ronnie? And I said, yes, please. Marvellous, he said. Have a cup of tea. And that was the audition.
He more or less, luckily, agreed with my instincts and was thrilled that I brought to him actors that he didn't know necessarily. They weren't necessarily film actors. Peggy Ashcroft, for instance, we'd been working with for 18 months on Jewel in the Crown, and I could not see anyone else playing that role.
It was a very interesting moment when we shot that, because Peggy Ashcroft had sprained her ankle, and we didn't think she'd be able to walk. She was pushed down a wheelchair, great ceremony and everything else. But she didn't really like being told how to play her part. I mean, she was Mrs. Moore, and there wasn't any buts about it. We couldn't have cast anybody else, and that was it. And she just wouldn't be told anything by anybody. So she just got out of the chair and did her part absolutely beautifully. Judy Davis, I'm very, very glad she was cast. I thought she was absolutely wonderful, because she had that sort of Australian toughness, which understated, but you know that she's got a lot of balls somewhere, and she does. I mean, she's very, very, very good. Otherwise, I don't think she could have pulled off the thing in the trial where she says, I was wrong. I mean, if it had been a sort of frail English beauty, I think it wouldn't have worked as well.
I was amazed by that choice, because she wasn't British and very Australian. I'd never really worked with anyone quite like her, actually. And she's not, I mean, basically she's not easygoing. I mean, she gets herself, under the skin of the part and becomes quite tricky to herself more than anybody else. And I think David found her quite tricky here and there. Funny thing was, they both got nominated. Judy got nominated for an Oscar. Not bad, really. And I think Peggy won one. So he did him pretty proud, I thought.
Alec Guinness was devoted to David, but had this sort of slightly rocky road with him and in his interpretation of the part. And I think, in retrospect, if you were making the film now, you would never cast a white person to play an Indian person because it just wouldn't be accepted, I don't think.
It was, I mean, everybody tried to persuade David not to have Alec for this part. But he said, listen, I'm an old man. I want my friends around me. I think he needed somebody he could really rely on to do the stuff.
Well, he always seemed to want Alec Guinness in every film he made, and even though they never really got along that well. And before Alec turned up, he turned up quite a few months after we started shooting, and David said to me one night, I think Alec's arriving, so I'd like you to look after him, because I can't possibly talk to him. I just can't. I just don't want to know about this a minute. And so, funny to cast him and then not want to talk to him. But anyway, and Alec arrived and said, I don't want to talk to David, so it was fine. So I had dinner with Alec a lot. But they sort of really admired each other and they sort of loved each other.
They'd done so many films together, and they very frequently had crossnesses. But it was never really very serious, and they really loved each other. I mean, Alec left A Bridge on the River Kwai without saying goodbye to David. And they didn't speak for another, I don't know how many years, until he did Lawrence of Arabia. And it was, Alec was always going to do a David Lean picture if he was asked. There was no question of that.
Peggy and Art and I thought it was rather strange. We were doing a film in India, and we had a British gentleman playing an Indian when everyone else was Indian. And I remember Alec coming down. I was having breakfast, and Alec came down and said, good morning. I said, good morning. He said, I had a terrible night last night. I wrote a letter to David, and I was going to be on the next flight home, but I chickened out, and he stayed, but he wasn't happy.
I think Alec refused to do some dance at the end of the film, which drove David pretty insane, and they didn't talk for a long time afterwards. Alec just said, I just can't dance. He said, I shouldn't be dressed up as an Indian anyway, and he wants me to dance, I can't do it. But, there you go. I thought it was fine. I thought his performance was extraordinary in a funny way. It sort of kind of works for me, because Godbully is, in my opinion, doesn't really exist. He's something that's come out of thin air.
Victor Banerjee was somebody that was suggested to us by Satyajit Ray, and David took a long time to make up his mind about him.
David gave Victor quite a hard time, I think, because he didn't feel he was Indian enough, which wasn't very helpful, I don't think. I think David was wanting a sort of a bit of. It seemed he was trying to sort of encourage him to be more stereotypical in a sense. And I think it was a huge part. I think Victor had quite a hard time in some ways.
There was always a debate going on, and Victor was very, very strong about holding on to his character and what he wanted from the character, and to play Dr. Aziz with passion and integrity and righteousness. David, on the other hand, just probably wanted him just to say the freaking lines, It was that clash of two different schools. You had the old school of acting, and you had this modern naturalistic acting that wanted to break through, and a lot of us wanted to do that. But as young actors, you've got to take stuff seriously here. You're going to be asked to deliver. You're looking around and there's Dame Peggy Ashcroft and, Alec Guinness, so you're on top of your game. And watching them, you realise, oh, I see, this is the kind of game. It really is that sort of concentrated and focused and thought through. And it was just a delight.
I think the whole cast were just wonderful, and I had mindfully made sure that any actor that came out to India really wanted to go to India. And I told David that. And he was thrilled. I said, you're not having anybody there that we wouldn't want at a party. And that's what you wanted from a great company of actors.
Back in the studio, we shot some interior scenes, mainly the caves and all the interior of the courthouse, and we had some good fun doing that, and it worked out fairly well.
Coming back to Shepperton was fantastic. It was the end of it all. You'd had India, you came back, you had the experience. It was the film was finishing, and then that was it really. There was the wrap party, and then everybody disappeared. And then you bump into David, sort of, at Pinewood, where he was editing it. And that was probably the happiest I ever saw him, him with his white glove, editing, enjoying it.
From a producer's point of view, there was no question that the man who directed it and wasn't probably the best editor Britain's ever produced. There was no question about him not having the right to edit his own film. He was just very good at manipulating these now antiquated machines. The span of his time, starting in silent films and coming right up to the films that he made, he really did know everything about editing.
David was very sweet and generous in inviting me to Pinewood Studios quite often to watch the editing process. So for me to see David Lean with the white gloves on in the cutting room, you don't see that anymore. And that was wonderful to watch it all. And he'd show me how he cut from one scene to another.
I think that was his biggest regret, that he never got Best Editor for this film. I think that was his regret. Of all the Oscars it got, everything that it got, it never gave him what he wanted, which was just the best editor. And I think he was. I think he was in the way he put films together, stories together, and also the way he lived his life, in a very editorial kind of way. Working with you now I'm with you.
I remember being invited to see a rough cut at Pinewood. And I had never seen a rough cut before. So actually, it had strange music on, and, it wasn't graded properly, and the colour was... So I just remember the sweeping vistas and the enormity of the whole thing. But not impressed exactly because it was far from finished. So I've never been to a rough cut since.
As a producer, you sort of get married to the project, and you sort of know everything about it by the time you see it. Nothing really surprised me. I think Maurice Shah's music made an enormous difference. It really was very, very grand and sweeping and good. I liked it a lot.
I remember at the screening, David pinpointing me and saying, "Well, dear boy, what have you got to say?" Being a fellow director, and I thought he had managed to overcome the problems of the book extremely well. It was a very brave attempt at it, I think. I mean, an almost unfilmable book. I think he made a really good stab at it.
The Forster novel, I thought, was not as big a story as the sorts of stories that he'd been used to with Zhivago, with Lawrence, with River Kwai, although I suppose he took it onto a big canvas. So the story wasn't that enormous, but with the canvas of India, he felt that he could lift it and put it on and paint it with a big broad brush, and that's what he did. So the film stands as a lovely Forster story, but put on this enormous canvas of India, which worked very well.
When the Oscar nominations, Amadeus was the other big competition, I think. And I was incredibly pleased, actually, the nominations it got, because it sort of validated David Lean as a great British director and his ability to select a crew and a cast that could tell a good story that people wanted to see and people rated. And actually, that was terrific. And, I'm only sorry he didn't make another film, really, because it would have been interesting.
I would say there wasn't a sense that it was going to be his last film. I mean, he seemed strong and, and powerful and absolutely in control. I think when you're doing a film, whatever size of the venture, you're so involved in just what it is on the day that it is that you don't think in terms of posterity. I can't believe it's 20 years ago, but it does now seem historic, it's in history for me now. And it's just something that will always be up there in a sort of frame as something, an adventure that you don't have again. It was wonderful.
Oh, I tell you, it was an honour to do, and looking back, it's an honour to have been in. And I met this wonderful man who then became a very, very close friend, and I saw a great deal of him, and then he was going to do Nostromo. So I was down in south of France being flown out by him because he wanted me to play Gould. So there I was round that table with John Box and all the guys and talking about the film, and I was, there we were. Maybe that might have happened. You never know. God didn't allow him to make that last picture, but I made a great friend, and I really, really enjoyed myself. I was very lucky.
It was, for me, the biggest film I'd ever been in, and still is the biggest film I've ever been in. It was just a great life-enhancing experience to be part of that, and to to get to India, to get to the subcontinent, and to travel about in India.
I think it was a remarkably good film at the end of an era for good British films. I think since then it's been a bit of a downhill struggle. I mean, I'm not saying because there aren't any more David Leans, there's some fine directors out there, but the grandeur and the scope of the subject has disappeared since 20 years ago.
It sits as the most exciting filming experience I think that I ever have had and probably ever will have. And I don't think that any productions like that are going to happen again, because it happened at a time when things had to be done for real. And nowadays, a lot of the things which we did then would not be done now, and it would be thanks to people sitting at computer screens.
The passage to India were of a storytelling and a filmmaking of a different time. I think it sits in the old school of filmmaking. It sits in that wonderful kind of spirit of, you know, where you did go into a dark room and it was quiet and the film started. And this thing just absorbed you. Absolutely brilliant.
Working with David Lean, I mean, he'd had a quiet period of about 13 years, I think, 14 years since Ryan's Daughter, which, because I think it was not received well by the critics and they were pretty unkind about it, I think drove him into sort of self-imposed exile, so wilderness years. And so when it was out that he was going to make another film, it was a great privilege, because, I mean, he was a great bit of British history.
He represented to everybody in the industry probably the greatest living filmmaker of his era, and it was extremely. I was extremely worried by the prospect, because I was only 30 at the time, and there I was due to work with a legend who was surrounded by all sorts of other legends from the business, people who had worked on endless productions of his, which were endless in their quantity but also in their shooting time. So I had a vision perhaps of being out there longer than it was due to be.
Everybody was terrified of his uncontrollability in theory. But in fact, when I worked with him, he was the most orderly, I mean, compared with other directors, the most orderly and frugal with film stock and that sort of thing, any director I've ever worked with. Unbelievable. Because, having been an editor, he knew exactly what shots he needed. And that's really what made him write the script himself.
Well, one of the things I remember about the script, which happened once we'd got out to India, David, he was very much the old school, and I remember Peggy Ashcroft saying, wouldn't it be a good idea if we had a read-through, which of course you do in many films, you certainly do in theatre and you do in television, and we all thought that would be a great idea. And so she suggested it to David.
Oh my God, there's going to be trouble here. So David said, but when? I mean, we're shooting every day, on the Sunday. He said, that's my day off. Anyway, she got away, and so we all had to go into this huge room. And David said to me, what happens at a read-through? Because he's never done one. So we sit around and read it. He said, that's ridiculous. We've already started shooting. Anyway, it was quite interesting, because we all sat there, and he then sort of grabbed the script and said, well, I'll talk you through this. And it took all day. But he had every single shot in his head. So my mouth was open the whole day, because I saw the whole film. He would describe the scene, each cut, we'd read the scene, he'd describe the next scene, each shot. And actually, it was a hell of a good thing to do, because we saw every single moment of the film from there on in, and he didn't change a thing.
David was an utter perfectionist who did not really accept compromise. And I think he found it difficult sometimes when people, particularly actors, would come to him with a suggestion, which is understandable. I mean, the process of making a film is organic. So an actor will come up with an idea and will want to perhaps put forward an option of saying it in a different way or doing it in a different style. And this sometimes proved to be a little bit of a difficult area with David, because he had very set ideas about how he felt it was to be. The actors to him were part of the crew, and they were there to do the job, and they were there to to do his bidding. And controversy sometimes raised its head when there were some sort of different approaches to characters and to ideas.
He wasn't great with actors. He wasn't terribly helpful with actors. I mean, one of the things which he did, which I always found very strange, was when he gave you a note, he would come up and whisper it to you, even though that you'd be in the scene as well. He would come up and say, "Richard, dear." And I just said, "Yes, David, of course." But he was slightly aware of the fact that he was a technical director and didn't like actors.
Well, I always remember about David Lean that he seemed to be particularly easy with what I call his middlemen, the people playing the character parts. We were allowed to get on with our jobs, I think, in a way that wasn't as problematic as it might have been for some of the people playing the leading parts. He was a dictator. He was a big man in every way, and I think people were quite unhappy sometimes working for him. I think he bossed them about a lot.
He got slightly fed up with all the actors and everybody around. And, he was complaining a bit about Peggy and Alec and probably me. I remember he was quite grumpy with me in Kashmir. So, you just knew he got a bit grumpy, a bit fed up with it.
The one thing he always loathed about actors was the highlighter pen. Because that's a really good one for actors, because it helps. You can just kind of highlight your bits and you can get to them quicker, know what they are, they spring up at you better. And his thing was I once asked him, I said, what do you loathe about actors then? You must loathe something about actors. He said, highlighter pens. I said, what's that about? It's like you give them a script which you've worked on for years and years and years, and there it is. And they go, "Oh, me. He said, you've got to know where you're coming from and where you're going to. We are telling a story. We are trying to work together here. What's the matter with you all? Throw the things away." Anyway, there you go.
I adored him, by the way. I thought he was just a hell of a guy. He didn't get on with everybody. I don't think he, at that stage of his life, he was quite short-tempered, and what he wanted to get there and then. A bit impatient, but I just thought he was God to me.
He was very sweet and nice, but he was a bit distant, not deliberately or anything like that. Because he knew when the work was being done well, he just sort of acknowledged it and went on. He was more of a imaginist, visualist. In his mind, you could see the way he was wanting the film, a particular scene to be done, how it would look on the screen. You could feel that.
There's a scene with myself, James Fox, and Saeed Jaffrey, and we're walking towards the camera, and the camera sort of pulls back, and then we sit down around this coffee table. So you can imagine behind us is a whole street of life going on. And the camera comes with boom, 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 boom. It's on the first take, and we sit down, and we do our scene, and he goes cut, and he comes up, and he goes, "Lovely, lads, lovely, lovely." The red shirt on the clothesline, can we change it for yellow, please? And you turn round, and about 300 yards away in the background is a clothesline with a red shirt on it. Now, his idea was that when you blow that image up, no one is going to be looking at my three actors. They're going to be looking at a red shirt. Change it for yellow.
The great thing about working with David was his visual sense. And I remember we went, it was a scene where the arrival of the train, we'd travelled out to the countryside somewhere with 200 or 300 extras, a brass band and a platoon of the Indian Army to shoot this scene. And it poured with rain. It just poured down for most of the day, and everyone was stuck in tents. And there was a little lull in the rain, and I went out, and on the platform there was David standing by himself looking at this train which was going to be used. And I said, very tough luck, this weather, David, with all these people. He said, yes, dear boy. Just look at this train here. I said, yes. He said, you see the front? I said, yes, which had a black front. He said, don't you think that would be better red? I said, yes, David, I think it would. So this man was called, and there was 300 extras and a brass band, etc. And he watched while this was painted, and he said, isn't that better? I said, yes, much, much better. He was a master of the visual.
We shot a sequence at the railway station when there's a whole the story of Aziz and Ada has sort of broken, and I'm sort of guiding Peggy through this crowd. And as we were rehearsing, David said, oh my God, cut. This is appalling. Cut. And we said, what's the matter? He said, well, the station is painted the same colour as Peggy's hair. We'll have to repaint the station. So we all went back to our club, and for 2 days while they repainted the station.
He really believed in looking through the lens, and he really believed in absolutely knowing exactly what was happening in that frame, of course, besides knowing all about lighting and the actual meaning of each lens and focus and so forth. A tremendous technician. It's very unusual to marry both a technician with an emotional ability, and the best directors have both. And of course, he had both, and it's rare.
The other great thing about David is he had a great way to give every actor a wonderful entrance into a movie. He was known for it. Look at the entrance in Lawrence of Arabia of Omar Sharif, the camel. What an entrance was that! Anyway, I remember shooting in the station in Bangalore, and it's my entrance into the movie. He said, I think I've got a nice shot for you. And the train arrives, and I walk through to meet my mother. I mean, it's lit. It's a heavenly shot, and he even makes me look halfway all right.
I think David Lean was the most remarkable director I ever worked for, but he was also one of the most remarkable men I ever met. And he was just an astonishing person, passionate about what he did, and absolutely focused. He was a most extraordinary craftsman, and his ability to put pictures together and to tell stories was absolutely remarkable.
The thing is that I think that 30, 40, 50 years ago, people had a much more rounded training in films. They had to do everything. And nowadays, everybody's a specialist at something or other, and it's completely different. You always said that he was a Boy Scout. He was ready to go anywhere and do anything and make a film about anything, really. And that's what I think his contribution was. He wasn't a specialist. He was just very, very good at it, at everything.
The legacy he leaves of great, epic, classical filmmaking is beyond reproach. And no one can touch it, never will touch it, because we don't make films like that anymore. And if they do, it's false, it's a fake. But all his stuff is real. So he is unique.